To remember. To bring to one's mind an awareness of someone or something that one has seen, known, or experienced in the past. Just for a moment, join me in remembering. Try to recall anything that comes to your mind. Maybe it's what you had for breakfast this morning. I had a double chocolate chip muffin. Maybe it's what you did last weekend. Maybe you hung out with your friends, having a good time just like always. Like always? Well, yeah, of course. When was there a time they weren't by your side? Try to remember how you first met your best friend. Sure, you might have a vague idea of what happened. Maybe. Well, what were they wearing that day? I guess that's a silly question, but now you probably can't remember. Well, what were you wearing that day? What did you eat for breakfast that morning? Well, I don't know why that would be important anyway. Try to think back as far as you possibly can. Well, how was your first day at kindergarten? How did it feel when you took your first steps? What did it feel like being alive? Not now, but the first time you had ever felt it. My biggest fear throughout my life has been the fear of forgetting my past, or at least as far back as I can remember. Now let's talk about what it truly means to forget, and what it truly means to be forgotten. Paladin of the Lost Hour by Harlan Ellison is a short story about an unlikely friendship between Gasper, a mysterious old man, and Billy, a young war veteran. The story begins with Gasper speaking with his wife, well, actually his wife's grave, reminiscing about an old restaurant that was getting torn down and replaced with a more modern store. Billy is also visiting a grave, but remains silent and still, as opposed to Gasper. Suddenly, Gasper is attacked by two men, and Billy comes to help. Together, they both fight off the two attackers, and they end up fleeing. Right from the start, the theme of this story is clear. It's about the past, and it's about how no matter how much you may want to stop it, the present will always be there to override that past. Despite this, we still remember our past. Gasper still remembers his wife, and despite her being gone, he can still remember her. In this way, her memory is still alive. After the encounter with the two men, Gasper and Billy go to Billy's apartment. The story continues as the two get to know each other a bit more. One similarity between them does become clear during this time, as stated in the text. Like Gasper, Billy Canetta was alone in the world. This culminates into a very heartfelt exchange between the two, and also one of my favorite parts of the whole text. I've been thinking a lot about my dying. I like what Woody Allen said. He said, "I don't mind dying, I just don't want to be there when it happens." I feel something like that, Billy. I'm not afraid to go, but I don't want to leave Minna entirely. The times I've spent with her, talking to her, well, it gives me the feeling we're still in touch. When I go, that's the end of Mina. She'll be well and truly dead. We never had any children. Almost everyone who knew us is gone. No relatives. And we never did anything important that anyone would put in a record book. So that's the end of us. For me, I don't mind. But I wish there was someone who knew about Mina. She was a remarkable person. With this, Billy would take up the responsibility of remembering. He responded, "Tell me, I'll remember for you." Gasper would tell Billy everything to know about Minna, everything he had remembered over their time together. Gasper gave Minna to Billy, and both Gasper and Minna could live on in his memory. It's an innately human characteristic to fear death. Everybody understands what it means to die. We know dying is the finale of one's entire life, the last memory in a long list of everything you've ever done. This is a scary thought, but Gasper has already come to terms with death. He's come to understand something many people never seem to truly recognize. Dying isn't the end of a person. It's just the end of their body, their vessel to interact with the world. Gasper knows that his wife is dead. He knows that there's no coming back from that. But he also knows that she was once alive. Gasper remembers her, and in a way that means she's still alive, even if just in loving memory. Gasper does not fear death, but that does not mean he does not fear. Every man has two deaths. When he's buried in the ground, and the last time someone says his name. Ernest Hemingway. Next, Billy finally tells Gasper about the grave he was visiting, and to his surprise it was somebody that even Billy didn't really know. He tells a horrible story of his time in the army. Many of the details are long forgotten, and he keeps mentioning it throughout his telling. The climax comes when his gun gets jammed and he's ambushed. He remembers how it felt at the moment just before he thought he would die. Then, out of nowhere, a fellow soldier jumped up and was killed in his place. As he jumped up, the soldier yelled something, but Billy was never able to remember what his final words were. Because of his fear, there's a large disparity in the quality of the details. Even the most unforgettable moment of his life had been slowly erased. Billy never got to know the man that ended up saving his life. Billy could not help but think back to what had happened. He wasn't my friend. I never knew him. I never talked to him, but I'd seen him. He was just this guy, and there wasn't any reason to do that. He didn't know whether I was a good guy or a shit or anything. So why did he do that? He didn't need to do that. They wouldn't have seen him. He was dead before I killed them. He was gone already. I never got to say thank you or anything. Now he's in the grave, so I came here to live, so I can go there. But I try to say thank you, and he's dead, and he can't hear me. He can't hear nothing. He's just down there, down in the ground, and I can't say thank you. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, why don't you hear me? I just want to say thanks. At the end of the story, Gasper asks Billy to accompany him to the graveyard one last time, as that day is the day he is going to die. He begins to worry about how if Gasper dies, he will once again be without a friend, and because of this, he does follow Gasper to the graveyard. At this point, it is finally revealed what a Paladin of the Lost Hour is. It is one chosen person in the world who has to keep the last hour of the world safe. The hour is passed down only after the current holder dies, but only ticks down either when the holder lets it or when it is not passed down. during the time it's ticking, you can talk to the people who have passed away. The only problem is that if the timer ever hits 0, the world ends. With this, Gasper asks Billy to become the next paladin, but with one final request. I ask for 1 minute of the hour, Billy. 1 minute to call her back so we can stand face to face and I can touch her and say goodbye. You'll be the new protector of this watch, Billy, so I ask you please just let me steal 1 minute. And despite Billy truly feeling all of the pain Gasper felt, he still had to say no. That was the final test to make sure Billy was ready to become the next paladin. Gasper was finally able to pass down the hour to its next protector, and as a final gift, Gasper gave 1 minute of the lost hour to Billy. This brings us to the last part of the story, which is important enough for me to just read the majority of it, but I'll stop before the end if you're still interested in reading this amazing story yourself. And he started the watch, whose ticking was as loud and as clear as a baby's first sound, and the sweep-second hand began to move away from 11 o'clock. Then the wind rose, and the sky seemed to cloud over, and it grew colder, with a remarkable silver-blue mist that rolled across the cemetery, and though he did not see it emerge from that grave, at a distance far to the right, Billy Canetta saw a shape move towards him. A soldier in uniform of a past day, and his rank was Lance Corporal. He came toward Billy Canetta, and Billy went to meet him as Gasper watched. They stood together, and Billy spoke to him, and the man whose name Billy had never known when he was alive answered. And then he faded. As the seconds ticked away, faded, and was gone. And the silver-blue mist rolled through them and past them and was gone. And the soldier was gone. Billy stood alone. When he turned back to look across the grounds to his friend, he saw that Gasper had fallen from the shooting stick. He lay on the ground. Billy rushed to him and fell to his knees and lifted him onto his lap. Gasper was still. "Oh God, Dad, you should have heard what he said. Oh geez, he let me go. He let me go so I didn't even have to say I was sorry. He told me he didn't even see me in that foxhole. He never knew he'd saved my life. I said thank you and he said no, thank you. That he hadn't died for nothing. Oh please, Dad, please don't be dead yet. I want to tell you." And as it sometimes happens, rarely but wonderfully, sometimes they come back for a moment, for an instant before they go. The old man, this very old man, opened his eyes just before going on his way, and he looked through the dim light at his friend, and he said, "May I remember you to my old girl, Billy?" At its heart, Paladin of the Lost Hour is a statement. It's a proof of how there's no stopping the passage of time. It's a proof that things can't stay the same forever. This isn't something that's easy to accept, but once you do come to terms with it, you can try and make sure that you live past your time. To survive death is simple. All you have to do is give someone a reason to remember you. For Minna, she had Gasper remember her as the love of his life. For Gasper, he was remembered by Billy as his one true friend in life. And Billy, along with Gasper and Minna and the two men, are all remembered by us, the readers. With us, now, the past lives on in our memory. We are the accumulation of all of our past generations, who we remember through their stories. Sadly, this way to escape death through being remembered is temporary, just as life itself is. Although this story helped try to soothe my fears, it still doesn't work. There's no escaping death, even through remembering, because just like being alive, you can't be remembered forever. At this moment, at every moment, in the past, present, and future, there is someone that is forgotten. There is a link broken between a past life and the present. The scariest part of this is that it's impossible to notice firsthand. When you are forgotten, there's no final hurrah, no thanks for everything you've done. Once forgotten, you no longer exist, and if nobody is left to remember you, then did you ever really exist in the first place? Let's take a look at a story about what happens to you once you're forgotten. Not by others, because there would be no way to write about it, but by your own mind. Telling, a chapter from Everything in Its Place by Oliver Sacks, is about the author's time working with certain dementia patients at a mental hospital. The first case discussed is that of Dr. M, the previous manager of the hospital Oliver worked at, but 10 years after his retirement, ended up being admitted to that same hospital with dementia. He was first admitted to the hospital after his wife had noticed him acting strangely. He would constantly be in a state of confusion, and his personality seemed a lot more aggressive than usual. After the first year at the hospital, Oliver recounts this strange experience. I have the melancholic task of seeing my former friend and colleague now fallen upon such evil days. He was admitted here just a year ago with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and multi-infarct dementia. There's striking fluctuation in his mood and mental state. He shows lucid moments or minutes and returns to his formal, genial personality, but for most of the time is lost in severe disorientation and agitation. Undoubtedly, the relation with a devoted attendant is good, and the best we can do, but unhappily he is driven and distraught for much of the time. It's difficult to know how much he realizes, and this fluctuates profoundly, almost from second to second. He enjoys coming to the clinic and yarning of the old days with the nurses. He seems most at home here, doing this, and at such times may be amazingly coherent, able to write, even write prescriptions. It's strange how a person can be held together by memories. In the case of Dr. M, it's clear that even when he has lost almost everything, there's still a place he can go to feel at home. Despite how painful his condition must be, I think it's interesting how Oliver pointed out that Dr. M is still happiest when he remembers who he is, a doctor. Sadly, in this case, the little he has left to remember does end up backfiring on him. He's always on the go, and for much of the time seems to imagine he's still a doctor here. Will speak to the other patients not as a fellow patient, but as a doctor would, and will look through their charts unless stopped. On one occasion he saw his own chart, said, "Charles, that's me." Opened it, saw Alzheimer's disease, and said, "God help me," and wept. Sometimes he calls out, "I want to die, let me die." Sometimes he fails to recognize Dr. Schwartz. Sometimes he fondly calls him Walter. And I had a very similar experience this morning When he was brought into my office, he was very agitated and driven, would not sit down, let me talk with him or examine him. A few minutes later, by chance, when I passed him in the corridor, he instantly recognized me, having forgotten, I think, that he had seen me a few minutes before, called me by name, said, "He's the best," and asked me to help him. In the end, Dr. M did remember who he was supposed to be, but this only reminded him of how much he had really lost. The most difficult thing about forgetting is realizing that it has happened, realizing that there was once something there. It could have meant something to you. It could have meant everything to you, but now it means nothing. Now what happens if you never realize what you've lost? The second dementia case of the chapter is that of Mr. Q, a school janitor. Similarly to Dr. M, although Mr. Q had forgotten most of what made up his previous life, he still seemed to remember his work. The hospital staff would even let him clean up, making him think he really still was a school janitor. Despite being rather forgetful due to his dementia, the one thing he would always remember to do was make sure all the doors were locked before everyone left the hospital. It was the one thing he was able to keep during the later end of his life. And if he had realized the severity of his condition, we can only hope that he would have been thankful for that. And though he slowly became more and more demented over the years, he seemed to be organized and held together in a remarkable way by his role. The varied tasks of checking, cleaning, and maintenance that he performed throughout the day. When Mr. Q died of a sudden heart attack, he did so without perhaps even realizing that he had been anything but a janitor with a lifetime of loyal work behind him. Should we have told Mr. Q that he was no longer a janitor, but a declining and demented patient in a nursing home? Should we have taken away his accustomed and well-rehearsed identity and replaced it with a reality that, though real to us, would have been meaningless to him? It seemed not only pointless but cruel to do so, and might well have hastened his decline. The first time I had read the second case, it really did feel like a happy ending. It seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? They made the right decision to let Mr. Q live the rest of his life in blissful ignorance, and to that I agree. But what I take away from this story is much different. When I really stopped to think about what happened, I realized that they never prevented Mr. Q's memory loss. They never saved him from forgetting. All they did was spare him the pain of realizing what he had lost. For that, I'm glad that he had never had to go through with it. But it also leaves me to wonder, if I were to lose myself the way he had, maybe nobody would ever tell me what had happened. There's a certain sadness in realizing that the best way to cope with the inevitable loss of yourself is really just to never try remembering what you've forgotten. The last piece of media I want to show you is Everywhere at the End of Time, a 6-album series by Leland Kirby that depicts what it feels like to go through the stages of Alzheimer's disease in the span of roughly 6 hours. If you haven't noticed already, this is actually what I used as the strange background music throughout the whole video. Now let's go through what each stage is trying to show you. Albums 1 and 2 are the tamest of the series, just being slightly distorted versions of old ballroom music. These stages are there to represent the first warning signs of dementia. In these early stages, it's easy to ignore the slight confusion. It's easy to just chalk it up to simple misunderstanding, a one-time mistake. Typically during these stages, the patient may not even realize that there's anything wrong in the first place. Some notable song titles are "It's Just a Burning Memory" and "The Love of My Entire Life" during Album 1, and later along, "Last Moments of Pure Recall" and "The Way Ahead Feels Lonely" in Album 2. As you can tell though, eventually what you have forgotten does pile up, and you will have to come to terms with your condition. Albums 3 and 4 are where the horror of what's happening really does begin to set in. The previously easily recognizable music now becomes a lot more hazy. It's harder to tell where one song ends and another begins, let alone if some of the sections are songs in the first place. This stage of the disease is typically the hardest on the patients. You can only imagine what it must be like to have your last bits of sentience being stripped away from you. Well, really you can't. But I believe that this series is the closest we can get to understanding what real people have to go through with this disease. Some notable song names during Section 3 are "Back There, Benjamin" and "Sublime Beyond Loss." But once in Album 4, 3 of the 4 songs are simply titled "Post-Awareness Confusion." Albums 5 and 6 can only really be described as the complete loss of one's place in the world. At this point, there's no music playing, or at least it's hard to believe that there is anymore. The sounds of the music have been so heavily distorted and muffled that there's no real telling of what any of it could possibly be. This is the final stage of dementia, and once here, there's no coming back, or at least that's what one would think. Although the titles of Album 5 mainly consist of advanced plaque entanglements, Album 6 takes a different direction. The first song title is "A Confusion So Thick You Forget Forgetting," which it definitely fits well with the indistinguishable buzz of what once was music. But during the last song, "Place in the World" fades away. Something strange happens just before the end of it all. Everywhere at the End of Time is the most emotionally charged piece of art I think I've ever experienced, which is surprising due to how simple it can seem. It does a great job of building up your fear, your sense of loss, of pain, almost of torture, just in the way that I could imagine Alzheimer's disease does to a person. Then, just at the end, when you think that it will just put you out of your misery, there's something there, waiting for you just at the end of your journey. Terminal lucidity is a medical phenomenon in which people with severe neurological diseases experience a return of mental clarity shortly before death. For most, it can last only a minute, maybe even just a few seconds, but that time could mean everything to you. Just at the end, when I had truly believed that I had seen and felt all that this experience had to offer, it had hit me with something different. After all that dread, all of that suffering, all of that forgetting, there's just one moment where everything comes back. Although this series at first made me scared of forgetting, I think that it's also done the best job at making me accept forgetting for what it is. I don't know if I'll ever truly get over my fear of forgetting. What I do know is that life is worth remembering. When Gasper died, even if there was just one person left in the world to remember him for the great man he was, that one person was worth it. When Dr. M and Mr. Q had lost almost everything, they were able to keep on remembering what little they could, in a way as acts of defiance against forgetting itself. When your place in the world begins to fade, there's still that grand finale, the choir at the end to praise you for what you've done, worth remembering. I will always fear forgetting, but until that final minute of silence, I will do everything I can to remember, because even if it won't last forever, the biggest tragedy would be not living a life worth wanting to remember.